Hi guys, I'm Jim and this is Jim's Fix-It Shop. And if you've been following my videos, I said the other night I was going to put bearings in the spindle on the snapper mower deck. This is the spindle out of the mower deck as it would be in the deck. I put all the stuff back on it so you can kind of see how it comes apart. So let me tip this camera down and we'll get to work on this. Now, I hope this don't stretch out to be too long because it's kind of important how to get this thing apart. I'm going to take the big nut off the top, holds the pulley on. Now the pulley has a hub sticking down that pinches the inner race of the bearing against the hub of the pulley by tightening this nut up to the shoulder on the shaft. And I'll show you in a minute why that's important. Take this bottom nut off. Now these are all self-locking nuts, so sometimes you have trouble getting them off. I don't have them tight. This is your blade adapter. This also unscrews. A lot of people have trouble getting this off because they don't know that it unscrews. Now on my spindle that's on, where is it? I have another one sitting around here somewhere. It's over there, I believe. Well, let me grab it. Okay, this is the other spindle. If I can get this nut off. This washer is flat. This washer, I don't know if you can see it, has a hub sticking out on the back side like the pulley does. So this one doesn't have any washers on top of the bearing, the small washers. This thick one with this hub is what pinches the inner race of the bearing onto the spindle when it's assembled. We'll put that one over there. This one has just a plain flat washer, so it has these thin washers on the spindle that pushes up against the inner race. Now what aligns this thing, getting it apart is not going to be a problem, because hopefully if there's nothing wrong with your bearings, you're not going to tear this thing apart. I always start the nut on there a little bit, get it flush, so I'm not pounding on the threads on the shaft. And of course, that's the wrong end. This only comes out one direction. This is the bottom of your spindle. I'm going to put this small nut on. And you can tell the top has snap rings in it. These snap rings are what holds the spindle into your mower deck. They're on the outside. They go in these two grooves. This inner ring is what holds the bearings together. You want to get that out. Then you can tap the bearing out of the shaft. That's the old bearing. You don't want to pound on a good bearing like that. Okay, these are the shoulders I was talking about on the shaft. When you got the bearing on there, and these washers on here, and this big washer, that pinches the bearing so the bearing will spin on the balls. Without that, if you've got a sloppy enough fit, the shaft will spin on the inside of the inner race and the bearing's not even working. Especially a new bearing is going to be real stiff, and these are not. That's how, in one way you can kind of tell that they're not any good. Now the lower bearing in this spindle housing just floats. There's nothing that positions it outside of these two shoulders on this shaft. That's what controls the distance where this bottom bearing is going to be. So just put a hammer handle in there and knock that bugger out. Now I had this apart once and I cleaned this all up. I don't know if you can see the inside, how clean and shiny that is. You want to keep it clean inside, especially if you use this style of a bearing. These bearings are what came in this spindle. I haven't taken the other spindles apart, so I don't know what bearings are in them. But this bearing has shields on both sides. Now don't confuse this with being a sealed bearing. I don't think they make one that's totally sealed. If you look close enough, you'll see a little crack right here. That's a gap between the shield and the inner race, because the inner race has got to turn, and if that was touching, it would bind up or you'd get metal particles down in the balls. Another style they have is shielded on one side, open on the other. I would not suggest using these, nor would I suggest using that grease fitting that's on the spindle housing. If you have two shields on your bearings and you have them in here, greasing that's not going to do any good. The grease is not going to get into the bearing until you've got one bearing here, you've got one bearing down here. As you pump grease into this, you have to fill this entire spindle housing full of grease and pressurize it with enough force to force it into that little crack. And before that happens, it's going to come out of that little hole. So greasing this is just about useless. I wouldn't suggest doing it. If you have an open bearing, which you don't know until you tear these apart, if your bearings are open and you have them in there, when you buy a bearing like this, they suggest greasing it 50%. What that means is you take a little, let me grab a scale. This is what we use at work for measuring stuff. It's a steel scale. It's kind of thin, flexible. And what I do is when I pack a bearing at work, 50 to 60% load. So you just draw an imaginary line across this bearing in half. That's 50%. You take your scale, you dip it in a can of grease, and you pack it in the bearing with the scale until you have that packed full halfway around. That's a 50% load. You put it together. Now if you over grease a bearing, you can destroy it. It'll build up heat, and the heat will react and expand the balls, and on a ball race it will destroy the bearing prematurely. So if you do get stuck buying these, make sure the inside of this is completely clean. No rust, nothing. Because when this thing is standing up like this in your mower deck, rattling around, your bearing is in there with an open side up. Anything inside that housing is going to fall in this bearing and destroy it. I mean, within a couple of days. You get sand or rust particles in there, it will destroy that bearing. I don't suggest using that bearing. When I ordered these, I gave them the number off of these bearings. Oh boy, this one is a SCO440LC3. I gave them that number. I ended up with this bearing. I called them up and said, wait a minute, this is not what I want. Well, that bearing should have had 2 L's in it. I said, well, it's not stamped with 2 L's, it's only stamped with 1. He said, well, we can get you the other bearing, but it's going to cost more. I strongly suggest paying the extra money and getting that extra shield on that bearing. Put them together, and you're not going to have to worry about oiling it or greasing it. They're greased for the life of the bearing. Put it together and let her run. Now to get the bearings in here, you can use, let me grab one. Okay, now when you put the bearings in here, the new ones, you got to understand where the force is being generated as you assemble this. So when you press this into the housing, all the force is against the outer race is where you're pressing it in. So you don't want to put something on the inner race and pound it in there. That puts, all the stress goes to the balls, and the balls go to the outer race, and then that's what's pushing the bearing together. And again, you can destroy the bearing. I use whatever I can find around, or I'll throw a piece of pipe in the lathe and turn it so it's the same size as the outer race. Set that on there. You're going to put in the top bearing first. And down inside of there is another snap ring that I didn't take out this time. Put this top bearing in first. Now another thing you could do is you can use the old bearing, set it on top of the new one, and pound on that. That's fine. I use a socket. Put that on there, it ain't gonna hurt anything. I put a board on there because I don't want to pound on my sockets. Tap that down in there. Some will go real easy, some will go really hard. You can use your drill press as a press. I've done that before. Now if they go in really easy and you turn it over and they fall out, that's not good. Because what will happen is your outer race can actually spin inside your spindle housing instead of your balls turning. If that goes in and falls out really easy, you want to use a product called retaining compound. Loctite makes it. It's a number 609. I use a lot of this at work. You just put a little bit on the outside of the bearing, smear it around with your finger, and drop it in. It'll take up to a 5/1000th of an inch gap. It will repair. So if you got a worn out spindle housing because your bearing locked up on you and it broke loose and started spinning in the housing, that'll take care of it. Now you want to put your top snap ring back in. Now when you put your shaft in, double threads go down. You want to put your shaft in until that shoulder hits that inner race. Then when you put your bottom bearing in, you want to push that down. There's no stop in the spindle. You could slide this, take the shaft out, you could slide this bearing all the way down till it hit the other one. The only thing that spaces it correctly is the two shoulders on that shaft. So you want to put that one in there. Now these slide in pretty good. And you can tap it in with a socket. Now to put your washers back on. If you had washers, some do, some don't. This has just got a flat, heavy washer on it. Put that on. You can put on your blade adapter. Remember, the bolts go down. Spin that on there. Put your nut on. This is self-locking nut. It's going to go on hard. Now the top you want to leave off until you get it up in your mower deck. Then you can put your flywheel on and your other nut. Now to assemble this, it works really good and easy if you use an impact. That's it. It's not that hard to change them bearings. You don't really need any special tools. I really want to, I guess, emphasize that if at all possible, you don't want to use an open bearing. You want a bearing that has shields on both sides. Now that is not a sealed bearing. And if you look up in here, we'll take this off again. This sticks up through the top of your mower deck. These snap rings go on here that hold that in place. And this one does not have this corrugated washer. And when I took it out of my mower, that wasn't on there. And that's why every time I hit something hard or I scalped the yard, the blade would deflect in there and it would actually hit inside the mower deck. That was because this part was gone. Whoever rebuilt this before me neglected to put that on. So make sure take some pictures when you tear this stuff apart. I do it enough at work. I have a system how I take things off. I get a desk, get my bench cleaned off. I put paper down. You don't want any dirt, no dust, no contaminants of any kind. As I take parts off, I lay them down. Turn this a little. I lay them down in a row, just the way they come off. I don't flip them over. I put them all down the same way. When I flip this over and take it apart, I do the same thing. I even put the nuts on the same way. Some of these are, most all of these are self-locking, and they'll screw on easy one way farther than they will the other. If you have to, take some pictures with your camera, with your phone, anything. I've done that before when I tear something apart that I've never got into before and it's pretty complex. I made the mistake of tearing stuff apart, and boy oh boy, you have trouble getting it back together, especially if it's something you don't have a book for, a diagram. So I mark things. I either use a permanent marker. Sometimes I use a punch, and I'll punch a little dent in the case somewheres where it's not going to hurt. This one I cleaned out really good. You noticed it was really shiny inside. I actually honed it with this cylinder hone to get all the dirt out of it. So if you have any questions, leave a comment at the bottom. Email me at jimsfixitshop@gmail.com. There's no comma on Jim's. Commas screw computers up for some reason. Send me a question, a comment. If you need help tearing this thing apart, let me know. I can, heck, I'll call you. As long as you don't live in South Africa. If you watch my other videos, you know what I mean about that. And also, I have to say, I got hollered at for my last video on the snapper model that's in the background here that if you've been watching, you've seen that run. I had a viewer holler at me I didn't have my flannel shirt on. They said, you can't make a video without your flannel shirt. So, okay, I put it back on. So I guess until next time, work safe, have fun. Let me know if you need any help. I am on Facebook, but I'm on Facebook under under J&R Woodworking. That's what this started out to be, is a woodworking show. But I kind of got sidetracked a little bit. So let me know if you need some help. Give me a thumbs up, share me with some friends, and we'll talk to you soon.